The first of China's two sessions political meetings got underway in Beijing this morning. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a political advisory body, convenes today, followed by the National People's Congress tomorrow. The bodies are a rubber stamp parliament which do not show deviation from the government line. This year's event is not expected to be anything out of the ordinary, but the US and Israeli strikes on Iran, a key Chinese ally, is casting its shadow on the gathering. And for more on the Chinese two sessions, I can welcome Jean-François di Meglio, Honorary Chair at the Asia Centre and Professor at Paris Dauphine University and the Public School of International Affairs in Paris. Good morning, Mr. di Meglio, and thank you very much for joining us. Can I start by asking you to tell us what the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference is?
Well, as we know, it's a yearly conference, so many decisions are supposed to be taken in just 1 week. That being said, you have 3,000 people gathering at the National Assembly and another 2,000 people at the consultative conference. But you have many more people in town. And that's the moment in China where, on top of the official decisions, many people talk about many other things which are of concern for them, and especially local policies and the global situation in China.
And what can we expect to come out of this year's conference? I mean, it's generally not very different from what the government does, but are there anything that maybe some analysts are expecting?
China is a turnaround in terms of demographics and economy. Usually the press conference first and then the Prime Minister's speech talk about the growth rate. Growth rate is supposed to be around 5% and it's supposed to be set during the conference. Since a couple of years, the mention was just around 5%. You remember that a few years ago, it was about 8, 7, 6%. So 5% is considered as quite low, but it's totally consistent with Chinese demographics and the slowdown in consumption and, of course, the collapse of real estate market. So there is a challenge for the Prime Minister in terms of growth. If China wants to keep it in terms of GDP, not GDP per capita, but gross GDP, over the next 10 years, it has to sustain a rate of 4.17% every year. The fact that demography is going down, the fact that the economy is slowing down as well, is a challenge. Now we also have the 5-year plan. The 5-year plan is supposed to be also rubber-stamped, as you said, for the next 5 years. And this is about innovation mostly. This is a key point in Chinese development. China is betting a lot on new technologies. It achieved a lot in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, with the 2025 plan, which was a 10-year plan in terms of innovation. But there is still a lot to achieve for that innovation economy to drag up the growth rate in China.
Now, the two sessions are unlikely to openly address the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, but is it fair to say that its presence will be felt?
Usually, the Assembly, the National People's Congress, is focused on domestic policies. Of course, as I said, with so many people in town, so high stakes in the world with an impact for China. On top of this, the turmoil in the army, because as late as yesterday, there were again 2 retired generals dismissed after the various rounds of dismissals in the army. So the geopolitical situation is, of course, unsettled by the Iran conflict, and China and Iran have a strategic union. So China has a very difficult decision to take, as about expressing more than just concern, expressing support to Iran, which is not yet the case, or just watching for things to happen and prepare for possibly the next government in Iran.
Now, China is highly unlikely to intervene militarily on behalf of Iran. It doesn't have a mutual defense pact, for instance. But do you think it might provide any other type of support to Tehran?
Well, China is, in terms of international crisis, not taking as high a stance as its geopolitical importance and the GDP importance should be. In a way, China's geopolitical status, of course, is quite important. Its footprint is quite important. However, China's voice is not as loud and as influential as it's supposed to be, except in what used to be called Global South. If you now look at what's happening in Iran, which is supposed to belong to Global South, which is belonging to the BRICS, to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you can see that China is, in a way, impeached by lots of weaknesses in terms of international relations, as opposed to, I would say, to what common sense would dictate.
Now, China is the largest importer of oil from Iran, and this is obviously something that there will be a chokehold on if this war continues. How might that actually play out in Beijing? What might the consequences be?
Of course, contingency plans exist everywhere. We do have contingency plans in Europe, and in China, there's no question about contingency plans existing. So the common knowledge says that they, just like us, have 3 months strategic reserves to look forward in terms of energy security. Of course, Iran is selling 80% of its production to China because of the various embargoes. For China, it's asymmetrical. China has always been very cautious to diversify its sources of oil. But still, 20% represents quite a lot for China. So I'm sure that currently there is a lot of thinking in China about how to replace this source of oil. We have to remember that in this big game plan by the US, it's very interesting that Venezuela was first struck. Now it's Iran. And you can maybe wonder whether behind the attack on Iran, there is also another plan, kind of strangling China's imports of oil, knowing that, of course, China is extremely depending on oil from everywhere. And of course, this is a hit on China's growth. So you may think of a potential game plan by the US to circle around China's exporters of oil and look at what's happening for China in terms of growth if China has problems sourcing its energy.
Now, with regard to the United States, do you think that China is perhaps a little bit reluctant to go up against Washington when we've just seen a thaw in relations between the two governments?
There will be a meeting, supposedly by the end of March, between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. So at the current stage and before the Iran crisis, the trend was rather to find areas of potential agreements. Of course, the trade war is still on. There's no question about the trade war being still on. But there is an apparent will to reopen the discussion. And as we speak, and in preparation for the late March meeting, there are some preparatory meetings between US and China. So it's not a G2. It's not an agreement on a lot of things, but there is still a will to keep at least a thread of talks and conversation between US and China.
Thank you very much for that, Jean-François di Meglio, Honorary Chair at the Asia Centre.